Today we are at Bonarme and we're going to take a nice little walk into the woods and we're going to see a dolmen and we're going to visit a megalithic site that we've never been to before, and we want to see if Jim can figure out what it was used for. So let's take a walk in the woods. Now up here on the left, the very first stop is the Dolmen de Bonarme. And here it is. So this dolmen is about 5,000 years old, and it has a couple of interesting features. See up here, these little indentations called cupules. Not really sure what they're for, but they're very common in megalithic structures and in Paleolithic caves. People would cut little circles into the stones, but we don't really know why. This capstone of this dolmen weighs about 10 tons, and well, I guess that's metric tons, so that's even heavier than 10 American tons. And here, can I have a flashlight? See what's down in here. And we have a passage under here. These types of dolmens seem to have been mostly used as grave sites. Oh, you also have to remember, most of these structures would have been covered with dirt. Keep that in mind with pretty much all of these structures that we're going to be seeing. They were covered with dirt, and they've just been excavated in the 19th, 20th centuries. So you're not really getting the full effect of what they would have looked like originally. Okay, what do you think it's for?
Because we're in France, I think this is where you prove your baguettes. Those baguette molds that they sell in the stores. But not really. It looks like a place you would use to like form wood or do like spear point stuff, maybe?
No, not exactly. You're closer with the spear point than with the wood.
Okay. Sharpen? To sharpen like a point on wood? I think they had were they using stone tools,
Well, this is the Stone Age, so
okay,
it's
using
stone.
stone points.
Well, maybe not for a spear point. What's another stone thing they used?
An axe?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what do you think?
An axe sharpener.
An axe polisher. Because this is a polissoir, and this is where they would polish their stone axes. And even the fact that they gather water like this, you know, when you're cutting and polishing stone, you need the water.
Whetstone. You could probably still sharpen a knife on there.
And so you can see there's a place up here, and then here's another one with much longer grooves on this one, but it might just be because of the size of the rock.
So I imagine they would,
Yeah,
if this is their axe,
yeah.
they would take it and polish.
You
like
can
that.
rub. I mean, you can do it.
Well, I don't want
Or do
to
you wanna
break
try
this.
the,
I don't want to break
one
the
with more
Neolithic artifact
Just give it a
and
little
just
rub.
go like this. I'm assuming that's what they would do.
So this is a good place to talk about the Neolithic polished stone axe. Now I said that very specifically, a polished stone axe. The three different eras of the Stone Age are characterized by a different type of axe. In the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, they would use flaked stone axes, where they would take a stone core, like this. They would take something like this, and then they would chip off edges of it with another stone or with the bone tools, probably stone, and then it would make jagged edges, and then they could use it as an axe. And when your axe got dull, they would chip off more flakes to sharpen it until you couldn't do that anymore, and then they would just throw it away. Now in the Mesolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age, they used a different kind of axe called a tranchette axe. And that was a longer, thin axe that they would flake off the edges, but then they would polish the edges some to make it a little sharper, and then they would attach a wooden handle to it. And then you could use that to cut down a little bit bigger trees so that you could use wood more effectively. Now the Mesolithic period lasted for around 4,000 years, and that was the main type of stone tool that they were using. The great invention of the Neolithic era was the polished stone axe, where they would take a piece of stone, cut it with another stone into a relatively rectangular shape, sort of trapezoidal, and then they would highly polish it on another stone and give it a narrow end so that you could use it to cut into wood better. But it was a heavier axe head, and then they would attach a wooden handle to it, and then you could cut down even bigger trees. And the fact that it was polished reduced friction and let you cut through wood better. It took a lot more effort to make the Neolithic axe than the previous types of axe, but it also let them cut down bigger trees so that they could use wood more effectively, so that they could build bigger wooden structures, so they could finally build wooden houses to live in. They could make wooden roads. They would take logs and line them up and actually make roadways out of them. So this is a really great find. It's a really unique find, and it really helps you see how they actually made all these axes, because they made tons of these axe heads. Farmers were always plowing them up in their fields, and they would call them thunderbolts, because I mean they didn't know where they came from, and they thought that they were maybe come down from like Thor or Zeus, and so they would call them thunderbolts. And so that was the old name for them before they finally figured out that they were 5,000-6,000 year old axes. Here we are at the covered alley of Boré, also known as a passage grave. And you can see, as opposed to your typical dolmen, that's really quite simple, this one is a little more elaborate. It has more stones, it's longer. This one has not really been restored in any way. That's something you have to keep in mind when you see a lot of megalithic sites, that they're not how they looked when they were found. They were a lot more collapsed, more ruins. A lot of them have been propped up, and some of them they've even made concrete pieces to sort of replace the orthostats. This one's very rough. We don't know how someone was selected to be buried in one of these, because clearly not everybody was, or we would find a lot more bodies in them.
Did they ever find more than one set of remains under one dolmen?
Yes. There's a Neolithic culture in Germany called the Einzelgrabkultur, and means single grave culture. And those would be sort of like a little covered alley like this, but smaller, and there would be one grave in it. Yeah, sometimes there are multiple people's remains found here, and sometimes they find other artifacts, but not much. It's not like you're going to find like they're not like these rich Celtic burials full of gold and things like that, because they didn't really have anything permanent back then. Everything they had was made of organic materials and stone. So anything that's wooden is going to rot. So it's very rare that we find wooden artifacts from the Neolithic, although we do have wooden artifacts. The Germans seem to be better at finding wooden artifacts preserved in the mud. These are not the oldest megalithic structures in Europe. These are around 5,000 years old. Around 3000 BC is when they were building in this area of France. The oldest megalithic structures in Europe are going to be in Portugal, Spain, and they go back to around 6000 BC. And then around 1,000 years later, there's some structures in England, but these are about 5,000 years old, which is still solidly in the Neolithic period. So these people did not have metal tools. They did not have wheels. And they didn't even really use draft animals at this time. So these were probably all just assembled with human power. And if they were cut and shaped at all, it would have just been with stone tools. They were even continuing to build these kinds of structures into the Copper Age. But that was still before the wheel was really introduced to Europe. Because even though the wheel was invented around 6,000 years ago, they didn't even really use it for transportation vehicles until a long time after that, until you're firmly in the Bronze Age. So by the time the Bronze Age comes around and you have people using metal tools, you really see an end to this kind of architecture. And that's because new people moved in. The Yamnaya people from the Russian steppes started moving across Europe, and they sort of outcompeted the Neolithic farmers, who were the ones who made these megalithic structures. So by the time people had metal tools, I guess they figured they didn't need to build these anymore. But people kept using megalithic sites for thousands of years after they were built, even though the original people weren't around anymore. And that's where people get the idea that the Druids and the Celts had something to do with this, but they didn't. But it's just people found these megalithic sites and were like, well, it's here, we can use it for something. And no, people didn't live in these. People didn't live in stone structures. People lived in wooden structures. They had houses. They would make houses out of wooden logs, and they would cover them with earth. One of the theories is that stone structures are for the dead, wooden structures are for the living, and that makes a lot of sense, because we find, the stone structures seem to be graves or used for ceremonial purposes, and it's just that all we have left are the stone structures because the wooden structures rot away. And the people in the Paleolithic mark graves with stones. We know that there's some Neanderthal skeletons in the National Prehistory Museum in Les Aisies. And the reason why they were preserved is they were covered with giant rocks, or they were sheltered under rock shelters where they were protected. And then sometimes they would carve cupules or other designs into the rock as some sort of a grave marker. And we know that they left flowers in graves too, even going all the way back to the Neanderthals. And that's something we still do.
Do they believe that they used rocks because it kept the animals away from the carrion eaters away?
I mean, that's obviously possible. We also don't know if people were buried with all of their flesh. We do know that there were some cultures they would either cut the flesh away because there's cut marks on some bones that are found, and I'm talking Paleolithic. I think that even still in the Neolithic too. And of course there's people who theorize, was it cannibalism? I mean, maybe, but not necessarily. I mean, it could be that they were defleshing the people to stop animals from disturbing the burial site. And there are some cultures that they would expose the bodies and let the carrion eaters eat the flesh, and then all that's left is the skeleton, and then they bury the skeleton. That's something that I know that they did in some cultures. Now this dolmen, I'm not going to get any closer to this because they tell you not to, because this one is under study and under restoration. But this is right next to the Bourrée Neuve covered alley. And this kind of gives you an idea of what some of these sites look like when they're found. Because they're so old. Trees have grown through them and broken them up and caused a lot of damage, and the stones have just been scattered over the years from all these constant cycles of freezing and thawing over 5,000 years. So this one's a real mess. If you don't know what you're looking for, you would just think that this was a pile of rocks. But it was actually deliberately arranged. You can sort of see how it's like the covered alley in a disassembled form. I mean, you can see how there's a couple of large top pieces and then some smaller vertical pieces that make sort of an alley.
Do you think that those alleys were covered at some point? Like, did they have
Oh yeah,
stones
they're
on
usually
top of
yeah.
them?
Yeah,
Okay.
the whole thing is covered in a covered alley.
Okay. And like, did it follow this little trench here?
I don't know if the trench, is. I don't know if it would have had a curve to it. I think they're usually pretty straight.
Okay. So it would have been like where that one's.
Yeah, I think it's more like this.
Okay.
And you can see in the drawing there, that's sort of the little drawing of how it is. And so you can kind of see the structure. You see how there's these big rocks and then the smaller vertical rocks. But yeah, these things they're just everywhere. They're just in the woods, in the fields, on hillsides. And they really weren't studied until, the past couple hundred years. People just really had no conception over who could have purposely built stones like this and why. But people were building them all over Europe for around 3,000 years. So this is a menhir, or a standing stone, but as you can see, it is no longer standing. It has fallen over. And this crack in it, I assume, is from freezing and thawing. So this was originally a vertical stone, and these are not as common in this area as they are in the British Isles. They're very common in the British Isles. Nuts falling on the car. Now, unlike a dolmen or a passage grave or covered alley, the menhirs tend not to really be associated with a burial. We don't really know what they were used for. They could have been some sort of a sign, a territorial marking, a boundary marking, a road marking, because yes, people did have roads back in the Neolithic. Now, there seems to be a piece missing to this one, so this was probably a much larger menhir. One of the theories about menhirs is that they were supposed to represent a Neolithic axe, because when you see them upright, it kind of does remind you of the polished stone axe, so that's one possibility. When more modern people started coming across these large structures, because they didn't build them, they didn't know who built them. And in medieval times, people thought that the devil built them, because only a demon could lift these huge rocks and place them. So a lot of times they would deliberately destroy these megalithic structures because they thought they were from Satan. And the Catholic Church encouraged their destruction. And the Catholic Church did not like that a lot of the country people would still use these megalithic structures for ceremonies and their pagan ceremonies. And that really upset the church. And so they would do everything they could to stop people from continuing to use these stone structures. And so they would destroy them, and they would tell people that they were from Satan and that you shouldn't mess with them. And no, it wasn't aliens either. People did this. People could make things. People have always been really smart and really capable, and people can do incredible things when they want to. And it's really doing people from the past a disservice to be like, it was aliens. So this is called the Allée Couvert von Blanc, the covered alley von Blanc, but it's not, I don't know why they call it that. It's also called like Hunnebad or something like that, which is like the Dutch name for it. But technically this isn't a covered alley, it's actually a type of dolmen. It's a specific type of dolmen. This wasn't found like this. This has been reconstructed. I mean, all the pieces are original, but it's been propped up back in new place. This site almost seems like it was a combination of the two types of structure of a covered alley and a dolmen, because it still has like the shape of the covered alley, but the height of a dolmen. Now, I guess you could imagine that if you just stumbled upon something like this, even if it wasn't propped up exactly like this, you would be like, who on earth put this here, and how, and why? Well, people in medieval times, it just didn't occur to them that people could have made something like this, which doesn't really make any sense because they were building cathedrals, which are made of stone. I think this is what happens though when collective memory gets lost. Because when it doesn't look like any type of structure that you've ever seen before or that people are still building, and you can't really come up with any explanation for how it got here, I guess the only explanation they could come up with was that it just fell out of the sky or demons did it. Sometimes the people would create legends about these sites in order to incorporate them into how they thought the world worked. So one of the local stories about this particular structure is that the Virgin Mary actually built it to shelter a young shepherdess from a storm. So sometimes people would just make up stories to make it fit into their worldview because they had no idea why they were really here. And people would continue to use them for ceremonial purposes and pagan rituals and things like that, and that really upset the Catholic Church. And so that's why they would even try to encourage those kinds of legends. This is the Dolmen de Barrières 2. There's several dolmens in this little area, and we're near the village of Menhir. And right over there, there's an abandoned village that we'll go check that out in a little bit. This dolmen is a little bit different looking because you see it's only supported by 2 orthostats, and then got this giant capstone being supported by just these 2. It's almost defying gravity. So another way that they can date dolmens and megalithic structures is by pottery that are found in them too. The different cultures had different pottery styles, and you can tell by the shape of the pottery and also by how the pottery is decorated, and that's how they will actually name a culture, like the funnel beaker culture, or the LBK linear band ceramic culture.
Do we know how old this one is?
I couldn't find a date for this one. Most of the ones in this region seem to be around 5,000 years old. Seems to be the time that they were building in this part of France. The oldest megalithic structures that you'll find in Europe are going to be in Iberia and also Brittany. Brittany has some of the oldest structures, but not everything in Brittany is 6,000 years old. They were actually building megalithic structures for a few thousand years. This one is long and is
right,
obviously supporting most of the weight, and then this smaller one is supporting the rest of it. So this dolmen is called the Dolmen de Barrières 3, and it's not far from the one that we just saw. And this is a very special dolmen because it still has its tumulus. And the tumulus is the mound of dirt that covers a dolmen. And it's very rare to find one like this. That's why this one is so special and why I wanted to talk about it. Because, like I said, most of the time when you find these, they've just eroded away or people have dug them up and they've been destroyed. But this is a very nice example of more of what it would have looked like when it was built.
So it really looks like a tomb now.
Yeah, you can really see how it looks. It looks much more like a tomb. So kind of like the last dolmen that we saw, you see how it's got these really long orthostats that are supporting most of the weight of this giant slab. I think this is the biggest capstone that we've seen so far, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. At least in this area, yes.
Yeah, and so this one has two about equal length orthostats on this side, and then there's a stone in the back, and it really makes it look like a gravestone. Yeah, about half the dolmens in France are called some variation of Pierre Levée, Pierre Levade, and the other half are called some variation of the Devil's Stone. So it's confusing to try to find ones when you're researching because they all have the same name. They're not particularly well marked on maps. If you look on Google Maps for them, they're just sort of in the general area where they are, and you can't always access them. A lot of times they're just behind fences, they're on private property. So if you do go dolmen hunting, just be aware of where you are and if you're allowed to be there. So they were growing some cereal grains, they were growing some barley and some wheat. They were doing a lot of pasture animals. They were raising sheep and cows. People were starting to drink milk at this time. And they were mostly using their animals more for their milk than for their meat. So Neolithic farmers ate a lot less meat than foragers, and so they were generally less healthy because they were eating more grains and less meat, but they were starting to drink milk. But back then the cows didn't give as much milk as they give now, plus the cow had to share the milk with the babies, so people weren't drinking as much milk as we drink today.
So the fact that they were farmers implies settled civilization, at least the beginnings of.
Yeah, they were more settled, and I think that's because pastoralists will move around a lot. They just let their herds move around and graze, and you graze out one area, so you have to move on to another area. But the farmers are being a little more settled, and so that might be why they're making these stone monuments, because they're staying in the same place constantly, so they're just more permanent structures. It could be ways of laying claim to the land, because also while you've got these Neolithic farmers, there are still hunter-gatherers around. You've got two different civilizations kind of coexisting in Europe at this time, and there's tension between them, and they had very different lifestyles, and the hunter-gatherers were actually healthier than the farmers.
So I'm thinking though, imagine you're a farmer, right? And this is all covered in dirt, right? You're 1,000 years after this is created. And you see this thing, you're like, I'm going to dig and see what's under that. And you find this opening. You going to keep digging?
Well, people have always been curious.
I guess. I guess I can understand why people are like, oh, the devil must have put it there.
Or it's an entrance to hell
right.
Or something. No, these things were incredibly mysterious to people of the past who didn't have modern archaeology. I mean, people 500 years ago didn't know what dinosaurs were. I mean, they didn't know anything about the past.
We didn't even have a concept of how old the past was.
Yeah, how long ago? They had no idea how. It would have never even occurred to them that these things were like 5, 6, 7,000 years old. This is a very, very rocky area. There's just rocks everywhere. And so I think the Neolithic farmers, they had to clear their fields so they could farm. So they probably would gather really big stones and use them. I don't think stones like this were necessarily cut and brought to the site.
just looks like something that just had to be put there with a crane. Like, it really does. It looks like, I mean,
It's hard to imagine just people with
Right.
ropes.
right. And I know I know it's not aliens. I know they were smart, but
The answer is never aliens, okay? It's never aliens. And it's never demons either. No demons, no aliens, just people.
really smart people.
Yeah, really smart people. Literally ingenious because they are inventing something
Right. We
that
couldn't
had never
figure
been
out how
done
to.
before. I mean, people had never built structures like this before.
I couldn't figure out how to move this rock, and I have an engineering degree. Without technology.